Hello, Agnes.
Hi, Robin.
We are met again to try to meet our minds. Uh, and this time I'm suggesting the topic of partiality. So the framing here would be that in many kinds of decisions that we make personally or collectively, there's some concept of efficiency or selfishness, what the decisions would be that would be most just directly beneficial, low cost, et cetera, to us, or in the service of an organization. And relative to that standard, sometimes we are inclined to be partial, to favor something else, something over something else out there because of our identity or allegiances. So we might be favoring our gender or race or our age or our nation or our region or some like our personality type, or we might have artistic allegiances toward one kind of art genre or another, and all sorts of sort of ideological things, including, say, open versus closed software, capitalism versus socialism, blah, 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 right? And many people get very animated and interested in trying to be partial. And I've been talking about AI risk recently with a number of people, and it seems like a central issue in AI risk is that many people basically just want to be partial toward humans as they see it. They see AI as non-human, and the risk that AI would, outcompete humans, and they are very disturbed by the idea because something that they are partial to would be losing there, and they want us all to coordinate to be partial toward humans and reject, say, the greater efficiency gains of AI until we can find a way to, get it without this loss. Anyway, that's the thing that was prompting me to think about partiality. It's also, say, the basis of sexism and racism or things like that, perhaps. If you thought people were, say, racist not because they believed the other race was different, but just because they wanted to be partial toward their own. And I think that was a substantial motivation in history, that people just wanted to be partial towards some side.
So we can distinguish two different forms of self-understanding among the partial people. One of them is, I just want to help my people, my crowd, because they're mine, in the way that most people would talk about, say, their families or something. Another is, I want to help my group because my group is objectively better than the other group. So we're just more valuable, and so we deserve more. And so one question about the AI, like, I want to be partial to humans over AIs, is which of those two positions are they taking? Are they like, I just happen to be the humans? The AIs might even be more valuable for all I know, but I want my group to win? Or is it like, no, humans have a special kind of value that is really important, and it's in kind of with an eye to that I want to be partial to them?
Well, most of the people I talk to are moral relativists enough to say, well, it matters to me, and I'm not sure if it's globally more morally better or something, but they just know that they prefer it. And the same way that you might prefer sort of your culture of the years you were born, say, and
Right.
disapprove of the next generation's changes to your culture.
Right.
But many people, do slip into the absolute terms there, and I think it is relatively natural. I think in Elephant in the Brain, we have a quote from Herodotus, how it basically everybody thinks that their culture is better than all the other cultures. Absolutely, basically, and so that's obviously said with a eye toward thinking people have a bias in that regard, therefore making you cautious about whether your personal sense that your stuff is just better is really reliably tracks what's actually better.
Right. But it seems to me they're two very different kind of sets of arguments, right? So one would just be to examine, are we going to necessarily be better than these AIs? Where if you could show that we're not, then you would be addressing that argument, versus I just have a visceral, this is just what I prefer. And like, if you tell me it's way more inefficient and has all kinds of other bad stuff, I'm just like, well, it's what I prefer. Not that's it. I'll just keep repeating that. Then at that point, that's a very different kind of interlocutor, I guess. I'm not sure we can predict how we could argue with them. If it's a brute preference.
I mean, in my experience, it seems to be more of a brute preference. That is, but we can question that if we like. But I think we have a norm in our society that for relatively mild differences, we're supposed to be ecumenical and encompassing, say. And for example, if you're in the humanities and I'm in the sciences or something, and there's some particular job out there that could go to humanities or sciences, instead of you or I just going raw our side, pushing for that job to be done by one of those sides, we could say, well, let's see who's actually better at that. And whichever side happens to be better at that job, I guess, let them do that job. And we're often embracing these sort of more neutral norms about many of the differences we have when they're relatively mild. But then we get to more to our core, things we really feel are more to the core of us, we're often just defensive and, not very articulate about why we're better.
I mean, it seems to me that pretty often we have norms about impartiality that introduce inefficiencies. So, uh, the demand to be impartial and to ensure that the system is impartial has a tendency to make, at least in my experience, make systems less efficient.
Well, I think when we don't trust people to be making choices for efficiency reasons, then we often impose some just uniform approach that won't allow for efficiency considerations to be brought to bear. I agree.
I mean, it might just be more efficient for me to hire my family members, because since we know each other and we have
Right.
trust among us, if I hire them as my colleagues and department administrators, the department will be more efficient. But we think, no, you shouldn't do that because it's partial.
And I think that's usually motivated by efficiency considerations. That is, we usually think that when we allow people to be partial that way, they're going to be using their partiality to make that choice and not using efficiency. And that's why we ban those. So when we suspect strong enough partiality, we often prevent a discretion in order to prevent the partiality, even if that discretion also prevents further efficiency.
So your thought is that, the reason why you're not allowed to discriminate in hiring, or you have nepotism and all of that, is because it'll be more efficient.
Yes. So for example, Western firms have much less nepotism than many other nations' firms. And basically, Western firms are more efficient, more effective because of that. Many other nations have family-based firms where a family runs the firm, and then they tend to prefer family members. And those firms, in fact, don't grow as large and can't expand to as many areas and are less efficient because of their nepotism. That's sort of a standard result in the business literature. And there's a perception in the West that you have to be worried about nepotism, and it's a risk that if you let people do that, they will not choose the best person for the job, but they will choose their family members. And then that's why there's this norm and often rules against it.
I mean, I guess that makes sense to me, but it just seems to me that at least there's also just a self-standing impartiality that is independent of efficiency considerations for things like hiring, for things like like selecting someone for a prize, or all sorts of
Well, if you select one summer prize, there's usually some norm of what the standard is for giving the prize. And then in that case, efficiency would be applying that standard, whatever it is. And then if you are instead giving it to people you're partial to, that would be compromising, corrupting the prize.
Right. I mean, I guess it's not clear to me that like the usual norm it has anything to do with efficiency.
Well,
Like
it does in my sense of the word efficiency, but so maybe the word efficiency is misleading here. But just, you know, in some sense, you might say we're being partial toward quality in whatever a metric of the quality for a prize would be. And the prize might involve some partiality in its definition. So, for example, you might have a prize to sort of some accomplishment in, I don't know, air conditioning. And somebody might have done a lot for air conditioning from an engineering approach, but we are biased toward the sciences. And so our prize wants to promote the science of air conditioning. And so we give the prize to a scientist. And that would be a way perhaps in which you could say our prize criteria was partial. But there are other contexts where we have sort of, in business, for example, sort of, say in terms of profit, a more standard reference point for efficiency, i.e. what would at lower cost give more value to customers, inducing more revenue as the difference for profit. And relative to that, you might have employees in a firm like, say, Google, making business decisions where they are not just maximizing Google profit or worker convenience, but they are being partial towards some programming language or some political agenda or some geographic location. And it's common perception that people empowered with such decisions often make them with some degree of partiality.
Right. Right. So it's like, I mean, I guess the way that I think about it is that we all belong to groups, a number of different groups, and those ties to those groups are very important to us. And they're part of why we want to survive, a really big part, maybe an essential. Right. So that like there'd be no efficiency without them, in the sense that we
sure.
And so maybe it's not so easy to calculate when the partiality is leading to an inefficiency, because maybe you have a background assumption, hey, we could get rid of all these groups, then we'd be super efficient, but then everybody would be totally demotivated, nobody would care about anything, and we'd all die.
Well, for employees at Google, we might say, we're going to pay you a salary, and with your salary, go feel free to be partial with it. But when we're making business decisions, make them for Google's benefit, because that's the way we're going to give you the biggest salary to go do things with. And we might even believe that with some decisions, you're going to be partial, and then maybe we don't pay you as much as a result because of that. We expect you to be partial, and in some sense, you're buying the power of being partial by accepting a lower wage for a position where you have some discretion that you can use it. And so then, that might be the business compromise, is we just expect some decisions to be made partially. And therefore, but we know that that comes at a cost, and then somebody has to pay that cost.
Right. But like, I guess I think not that we can banish group allegiance outside the workplace seems implausible to me. That is, people have allegiances to their colleagues in their workplaces, and if they didn't, they'd be demotivated from working.
Sure.
And so the workplace itself has to create allegiances and partiality, and has to sustain that partiality, and that's not. And you could see that as leading to inefficiencies, but that wouldn't make any sense, because it's a condition on the amount of efficiency that you do have that those exist.
But you might be able to express all your partialities outside of your business decisions, perhaps. I mean, work isn't everything. So, and you might think that just by being at Google and being in the position you are is already able to promote your partialities. That is, you might be partial toward things Google represents and that Google promotes in the world, even when it's just maximizing profits.
I mean, remember our conversation about that moral mazes?
Right.
It seems like the idea of um, distributing the partiality outside the workplace environment seems very naive from the point of view of moral mazes, where the workplace is just like a nested set of allegiances. And that's like, at least at the managerial level, like what you're saying might be true of like the person on the factory floor. But the work of a manager is managing allegiances, as far as that, if that book is true.
And part of the tone of that book was to lament that structure and world because it looked inefficient, and it does look inefficient.
Right, but the point is, like, it might look inefficient, but also this is the thing that works. So that's sort of my point, is that there's a thing here where it might look like you can get rid of it, but it might be that all the efficiency we have is conditional on having this kind of partiality. Yeah.
So getting rid of it isn't on the table here, so I'm happy to not be suggesting it could all be gotten rid of. But one kind of partiality that I'd like to call attention to, I guess, is a partiality that basically tries to sort of squash something and get rid of it. And so there are many like technical decisions in the world, say between open source and closed source software, or one particular programming language or another, or using fossil fuels versus alternative fuels. And a thing that happens is people get a partiality on that sort of axis, and then they often try to coordinate, sort of promote everybody to sort of be on their side and to be against the other side. And they're often trying to use network effects in the sense that if they can reduce the other side enough, they will just go away, because you need enough people doing the other side to keep it a viable thing. And if not enough people use fossil fuels, then nobody can, because it costs some infrastructure costs to support the system of fossil fuels. And similarly for some programming language tools or something, if nobody uses a certain set of tools, then it just won't exist. And so often partiality is some sort of a war where one side is trying to eliminate the other side, to exterminate it, really. And often that succeeds. And so there we might ask the question whether it was good that one side exterminated the other.
It depends on whether the thing that was exterminated was good.
Yes, of course. But we might worry that with enough partiality, people wouldn't be paying enough attention to whether it was good, and they'd just be paying attention to, being loyal to their side. So that's a kind of thing that happens that makes you worried about partiality.
Okay, so we've articulated one thing that should make you cheer in favor of partiality, namely, it looks like a condition on our being motivated to do anything at all, and structures all of our relationships inside and outside the workplace. And then one thing against it, which is that it occasionally leads people to coordinate to eliminate the other side, and occasionally some of those eliminations are of good things.
Yes.
Okay, I'm just summing up where we are. I feel like on net we're still pro partiality.
Well, I think it's maybe less about whether we should be pro or anti partiality, or as opposed to which kinds of partialities we should allow ourselves to seduce us, basically. So
okay, so which are your favorite kinds of partiality?
Efficiency, perhaps, which is more of a paradox here, I guess. But so
I think that's just not a kind of partiality.
Okay, but so in, say, the AI risk discussion, one way it might be framed is some people are worried about some human essence being lost. And they look at things like love and laughter and the sacred and anger and creativity. And they say, I'm worried that AI will throw those things away and they will be lost. And I'm partial to those things. And I'm really partial to those things. So I think any substantial AI displacement of humans is horrible and basically a catastrophe.
Mm-hmm.
And I might say, well, I like those things, laughter, love, humor, the sacred, etc. But I might say those seem like somewhat robust things that minds might have, language. And so I'm less worried about them going away. And people come back and say, well, what they mean is the human versions of those things. Sure, there might be some kind of machine love and machine laughter and machine sacred, but there's some special way these things are packaged together at the moment in a human, and they're really partial to that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a place where I tentatively feel less partial. I go, I'm not so sure why I care exactly that it be a particularly current human style version of these things. But I mean, another related example is just, human culture has changed enormously over history. And I feel less partial to our current human cultural features compared to cultural features that our ancestors had, and then presume that our descendants will also have quite different human cultural features. And many people feel very partial to our particular culture and its particular features, and they are afraid that those might go away.
Okay. So, but like at that point, you have some preferences and they have some preferences. Now we have a standoff between you don't care about these very human things. They care a lot about them. Where does the argument go from there? Neither of you has given any kind of reason as to why your preferences are good ones to have. You just both have a set of brute preferences. Neither of them seem persuasive to me as like a thing, as a place.
So the next step in my analysis might be to look at when efficiency correlates with a divide like this. So
hold on, before you go to that next step, if you we have to make a prediction about your interlocutor. Do they care about efficiency? Because otherwise you're not arguing with them, you're just arguing out of space, right? Now my prediction is they don't care. They care about these things, and they want these things even if they're going to be less efficient. So I'm just not sure it's relevant whether we can get increases in efficiency, because that will be you arguing with yourself. You're partial to efficiency. They're not.
I'm pretty sure that given the concept of efficiency I have in mind, everybody cares about it. You might not realize you do, but everybody cares a lot. So
do a Twitter poll. Do you care a lot about it? Let's see what.
If I just use the word, that won't work because I'd have to explain what I meant to them.
Okay.
So let's take our prototypical example of, say, discrimination, say racial discrimination in the U.S. South, say in mid-20th century.
Yeah.
A description is usually of the form that people are being treated unfairly with respect to an efficiency standard. That is, the people with the same qualities wouldn't be hired for the same job. You couldn't sell land to the same people for the same price. There was a coordination to prevent the usual efficiency processes from just letting people locally find the best thing for them, because there was a coordination saying you must keep blacks in their place and can't let them fill various roles, even if to you that would seem to be the sensible thing to do. And so a criticism of that sort of world is this idea that they are impoverishing themselves by that. And a similar thing in gender discrimination. One of the biggest arguments against gender discrimination was that we were hurting ourselves arbitrarily by not letting, say, women fill roles that they were equally qualified to fill as men, and by preventing that, we were all worse off.
I don't think that's the usual criticism. I don't think that's what most people think is wrong with that situation. And you could see it by saying, let's say that in some inefficient economic system, okay, communism or something, they had some gender or race discrimination. Is that fine? Because it's inefficient anyway, and it's not adding to the inefficiency to have the discrimination. And most people are like, no, discrimination is wrong because you shouldn't disadvantage people on the basis of these features. And that has nothing to do with efficiency. It has to do with the fact that you're supposed to be impartial and not discriminate.
So any organization like Google, say, if they are doing something in efficiency, then in essence, there's less for everybody. There's less wages, less office space, less customer service, less profit for investors. So if you want more of any of those things, you implicitly want more efficiency, because efficiency gives you more of stuff. So that's the sense in which everybody wants efficiency, because everybody wants more.
Maybe you don't want so much more. I mean, there's lots of people who are like, we should all be making do with less. We have too much.
But when they make their personal choices, they make personal choices to get more.
Sure. And when people make personal choices, they also are partial in all sorts of ways. But you might think, yeah, but as a group, we should be scaling. People talk like this. We shouldn't be trying to get more all the time. All I'm saying is, like, your efficiency, I don't think it's obviously some value that everybody has agreed to. You said you're partial to it. That's your preference.
I will still argue that, in fact, given people's actual choices, they are, in fact, partial toward efficiency. That is, efficiency is just another name for giving everybody more.
I just don't think everybody wants to give everybody more. I think some people want, like, the rich people to have less and the poor people to have more, but they want the poor people's more to come from the rich people's less. That's just super common.
But even giving poor people more, efficiency gives poor people more.
Right, but they don't want to give poor people more. They only want to give the poor people more on the condition that it comes from the excess of the rich people. They want redistribution. They don't want more. They don't want the total to be bigger.
I think most people do want the total to be bigger, but I'm sure you can find people with any possible combination of views, and I don't doubt that. But still, I think, again, partiality makes sense with respect to some standard of an impartial choice. We can't really make sense of it without reference to some standard.
I agree. I just don't think that impartiality has much to do with efficiency.
I don't think you understand what I mean by the word efficiency then.
Okay.
Because efficiency is just a way that you can get more of anything, right? Whatever the things you want.
I think impartiality doesn't have to do with getting more of anything.
But almost all the things we value is valuing more of things. There are various things you want more of. So you want more philosophy, that's valuing more. Then it's just another way of saying all the things you want more of them. That's another way of saying you want them. You can't really want them without wanting more of them.
Right, but I might just want the world to be more impartial, where that's not going to translate into wanting more of stuff. In fact, it might just that might just mean we all get less stuff if the world is more impartial, because we have to.
You might be willing to make that trade-off. I'm just saying there's something other than impartiality you want, and whatever it is, we can talk about you wanting more of it, and that's what I mean by efficiency, is just getting more of the other stuff.
That's fine, but now you've just conceded that wanting impartiality is separate from wanting more. Right? Those are two independent things you might want. The reason we think discrimination isn't because we want efficiency. It's because we think discrimination is bad. Then we also want efficiency. Yes, that's an additional thing.
But if impartiality does reduce efficiency, then we could also want it for that reason. We could have two separate reasons.
Right. I think impartiality sometimes increases efficiency and sometimes reduces it. I think
there are many of these other kinds of impartiality, like, say, Star Trek versus Star Wars, right?
Yeah.
People don't have a big moral thing about making sure we treat those impartially, right? We aren't worried that some people favor one side or another in general, but if were stocking some movie library or something, we might want you in that role to be impartial so that we could trust you to serve our customers who are stocking a movie library or something. That is, there could be some roles in which we would want you to be impartial with respect to that, even if in general we don't think there's a moral problem with people being partial to one of the others.
Right. But the reason why you wanted that might not be efficiency. I could imagine somebody who owns a video store, and he doesn't want his clerks, pushing Star Wars over Star Trek to people. And they point out to him, look, when we do that, when we push them, we end up with more customers buying things. And he's like, that's not the kind of store I run. He has a sense of self-respect, and he's willing to lower sales in order to have impartiality. I mean, that seems perfectly coherent to me. So they do seem independent. I want to ask you a question about, so you're not very worried about the human versions of love and laughter, etc., being a bit transformed by AI, because you think that the fundamental things driving them are sort of robust against the incursions of AI. And so this wave of forces that's going to transform us and delete some things, you're like, yeah, but the things that it's deleting are not that valuable, or other forms of them will come into place. Why don't you accept the same form of argument about the thing where because of partiality we coordinate to squash something and get rid of it? Like, why can't those people say, well, look, those things are pretty robust to these incursions of partiality, and like some other form of it is going to survive, maybe not the exact one we had before. Like you're freaked out about one thing, they're freaked out about another thing. You're pretty calm about the thing they're freaking out about. Could they calm you about the thing you're freaking out about by employing the same argument?
Well, this is where I would invoke the concept of efficiency.
I see.
So, for example, in the United States, we have what many of us consider a pretty dysfunctional process by which we review building infrastructure projects. Compared to Europe, it just takes us a lot longer. Things get a lot more expensive because we allow so much citizen participation in the review of such projects.
Mm-hmm.
And so you could just think about this on one axis of citizen participation versus, rich developer power. And on that axis, you might think, yay, citizen participation. But I might say, but these two sides of this axis aren't at all equal on efficiency. One is just much less efficient than the other. And so if we allow this side to win here, say just through this coordination process of trying to squash the people who promote the other side, and it gets entrenched, then all the rest of our society gets taxed because of that. And all the other things we want to be partial to, we are less able to be partial to them because of this tax. And that's an issue I wanted to highlight here, is when we let when there's a correlation between efficiency and these sides, which there often is, then by choosing one side and letting them squash the other, we all just have less capacity to do things.
So, I mean, there was one version of your definition of efficiency where it's just like more good stuff. And you might think that the various kinds of good stuff are incommensurable, and like they don't add up into just a big pile of good stuff. And that like one person's like, look, by good stuff, I mean citizen participation. And I am getting more of that good stuff by the current regulation process. I want more good stuff. That's why I'm doing it. Efficiency is my ground according to that definition of efficiency, right? And you're like, well, no, we have to count in all the other kinds of inefficiency, and then we have to come up with some sum total. And they might think like that they could agree that we want more good stuff, but disagree that you can do that sort of math. And so you can't import the legitimacy of doing that math just by using the word efficiency.
So this is a problem with us where I want to inherit a bunch of standard concepts in economics, and you resist. That is, we have a standard structure in economics by which we do these comparisons, and that we do add them all up to sum total, and that's why we can talk about efficiency. So
there's a standard resistance to that on the part of the outside world, where that structure is not acceptable to the people that you want to persuade. And so just presupposing it isn't going to help you make your case.
Well, they're not in the room at the moment. I'm talking to you.
I'm voicing their concerns right now.
But it would take us a substantial detour to go into the usual economic analysis of efficiency and why these things are comparable and why you can add them up.
But I think this is what partiality is. I don't think it's a detour. I think partiality in part is the idea that there are some goods that can be summed up with other goods.
That doesn't at all seem right to me. That is, the idea of partiality is just favoring one side. That doesn't at all imply they can't be compared.
I think that
incommensurability is a whole different claim than that you can favor one side or the other.
I guess I don't think they're so different. So I think that like if you favor some side or some group, then you're going to be a bit resistant to um cashing out of that. Be like, yeah, I favor this group, but if you pay me enough, I'll favor the other side. You're going to want to say, no, my partiality can't be bought in that way. It can be, I'm not going to exchange it for money value. So I actually do think that those are related. Like, well, if people pay you enough money, would you support some other family other than your own family? Like you would probably say to yourself, there's no amount of money, or maybe not you, but most people would say there's no amount of money for which I would do that, which is to say that my partiality amounts to an incommensurability, or rather incomparability.
Well, we could represent that as just one has a much higher priority than the others. I think we could maybe set this dispute aside by just saying, when we favor one side or another of a particular division or partiality, that can come at our cost of our ability to favor other kinds of partiality. We don't necessarily have to agree on the weighting of that, but that would be the key observation to notice, is that there are trade-offs between these things. If we go far enough to promote citizen participation in building projects, then we will just not have very many building projects, and we won't be able to do, solar energy or mass transit or lower housing costs. There'll just be a bunch of other things we can't do so much because of favoring that one side.
Right. But I think that there's actually two different ways to frame that. One of them is one form of partiality versus another. That argument, I think, is often rhetorically persuasive versus one form of partiality versus just other good stuff that can be summed together. So, like, for instance, if there is some particular group that is going to be disadvantaged because of our high valuing of citizen participation, like poor people say, right? Say we are doing so much citizen participation, but because of that, there's a group of people that are like homeless because they can't get homes. Now you got yourself a persuasive argument. Why? Because you're pitting partiality against partiality. Whereas if you say, if we do all this citizen participation, then we're just wasting money on that. And there's all this other money that we could use for whatever we wanted. That's going to be less persuasive to the friends of partiality.
But money lets you be partial. That is, if you wanted to help poor people, money is a thing that lets you do that. If you don't have as money, you can't do as much of that. So
I'm just telling you that those are two different arguments, even though you're right that that's a thing that people could use it for. It's only when it's framed as designated for that the argument gets its power.
But I don't think we need to settle this to use this observation in the further point I had in mind, which is just to say that I'm attentive to the cases where being partial to one side or another will greatly reduce our capacity to promote many other things.
Right.
And I want to be especially wary of that. And that's a kind of partiality I'm especially concerned about. And say with respect to the AI risk issue, I would less say that I just don't care about the difference between human love and AI love than that I see an enormous loss of foregoing the AI. That is, the AI is this enormous potential wealth improver, capacity improver to just do many things.
Right.
And so giving up on that, you see, in order to promote this one partiality would greatly reduce our capacity to address a great many others. So that's the parallel I was trying to set up.
Right. I guess what I'm saying is that I sort of predict that just saying, well, we can do many things is not that persuasive. That many people don't care about the ability to do many things. They care about the ability to do certain specific things. And if you say, we're all going to do those exact things, then maybe you'll persuade them. But if those are just some things you could do, but you could also do other things, they're not going to be persuaded. And let me say why I think they're not crazy to think this way. The reason why we care about partiality, the reason why we're attacked, is that values don't come for free. That is, the thought that you care about anything isn't that you don't just get that for free. You don't get caring about things without work, without costs generally. And so you could be in a position of having tons of resources, things that would allow you to do many things, but be totally demotivated and not want to do anything with them and just lie down and atrophy till you die. Because you don't care about anything. So there's nothing you want to do. And I think that people feel like when you're offering me this kind of future where we give up on human love and human laughter, etc., and then we have this power to do many things, I'm going to be in this state where I'm not going to be motivated to do any of it. I'm not going to want to do anything with all my giant amounts of resources, which is maybe how they also might feel about how, if my neighborhood is taken over by big, tall buildings, and I get lots of money for it, there's nothing I want to do with that money. What I wanted was to live in the nice neighborhood with the short buildings. And so their value attachments are they're like these fixed points of value attachment. And if you take, and those are the forms of partiality. If you take enough of those away, it doesn't matter how much you compensate with money or the generic power to do many things.
That just sounds to me like another way of saying there's some things you could value a lot, such that the loss of them would be catastrophic, because you're describing a catastrophic loss.
That's right. I think that for most people, human love and human laughter in the forms that we have them are those things.
Is voter participation in building projects those things that, and so we could go
to a lesser degree,
because we didn't have that, before 1950. So, and people seem to live meaningful lives then with motivation. So
right.
it's hard.
There was a time when you didn't have a family, you didn't have a wife and kids. So if we just got rid of them all now, you should be fine, because there was a time when you didn't have them.
Well, I might value them a lot, but I don't believe I would lose all motivation.
But many people do. If you if suppose the deaths of everyone they've met since they were 12 or whatever, that would be devastating, at least for some people. And some people would lose all motivation until they managed miraculously to form new attachments if they did. So, I guess I think it's just not nothing to take away someone's attachment.
I guess this is related to what I think of as sort of a big underlying issue in these futurist debates related to AI risk, which is just that if people could really see how much change might plausibly come if they allowed change to happen, they might just want to veto change because they are attached substantially to the world the way it is. So if you say...
If they weren't attached in those ways, they wouldn't do all the things that lead to the change either. That is, those attachments are part of what innovation relies on. So you don't want to get rid of them.
But nevertheless, if we let them fully act on a clear view of where it will all lead, they would prevent all the change.
Or they might just fall into a depression.
Right. So there's this question of when people put a high value on some things, what kind of a high value? I think that's kind of the issue. That is, when we have small values on things, we're often willing to trade them off for some other small value thing or a modest increase of something else that we value highly. And, in our world of ordinary consumer shopping, we are quite capable of taking a limited monthly budget and choosing between all the various things on offer,
right,
in order to get a mixture of what we want. And in those cases, we're perfectly well acknowledging that, we want a little bit more of each thing, and we're willing to compare those to each other and say, how much of one do we like compared to a little more of another? Right. And then when we get to these big things we value, we often switch modes, and we might say, I refuse to compromise on all of it, and I need to have it. And if I don't have it, I will just be demotivated. I will lose all motivation. We make sort of big threats about any compromise on my big things.
Right. That's why some people think decision theory only works for medium-sized decisions, not for the really big ones, and also not for the really small ones when the two choices are...
Presumably you mean traditional decision theory, because these are decisions, so presumably some decision theory applies to them. It would just have to be a different decision theory. I mean, decisions happen. There must be a theory of how they happen, right?
You might think that if the values are large enough, it's best not to model not to model it as a decision, but to think of the uh, to think of that as a moment inside of a longer time period where the person is learning something. So it's like a learning process.
That's just another way of describing it, but it's still a decision. So that's a theory of the decision. So it's not.
I don't think so. Because like I think that um, uh, if you couldn't become aware of it, if there in principle could never be a choice point, then it seems to me that that's not correctly described as it.
We're talking about people making choices, though, right?
No. So we're talking about a situation where someone ends up going one way rather than another, but there is no choice point.
They didn't make any choices that influenced the one way or another. They had no causal effect on the path.
So think about this. Say think about an this is an analogous case. Suppose I wanna learn I want to understand some physics formula, right? And you explain it to me, and I still don't understand it. And then you explain it again, and I still don't understand it. And then you do, you might say, I've decided to understand it, but I haven't decided to. I mean, I don't understand it, right? I've decided to try, right? And I'm trying, but I'm not getting anywhere. But then you explain and explain and explain, and after like a year, I finally understand it. Now we want to say, did I causally influence my own coming to understand it? Yes, right? I mean, I clearly played a causal role. For instance, I would ask you questions to explain stuff. But I also think that there's something wrong with, I mean, there was certainly no point at which I decided to understand in the sense that I decided to become enlightened about it, right? That's not a thing I could decide. But the process was essentially stretched out over time. There wasn't a choice point. There was an initial choice point where I decided to try, but my point is there was no choice point where I decided to become enlightened. So I think that this is how it is with large value transformations. There is no choice point. We're learning over the whole time, and it's and the transformation is not the object of our will in the sort of way that would be required for like weighing pros and cons, like I weigh pros and cons of understanding it.
Our concrete examples here were people concerned about AI risk and then considering making a ban or pause on AI research in order to avoid the AI development, or another example of people wanting to change our development regulations in terms of citizen participation. If you say, people say, I don't want to change our development rules for citizen participation because I find our existing cities to be so important to me, that's a choice that the choice to not change the regulation, or similarly the AI regulation, are choices. So those choices would have decisions, and they have decision theory describing those choices. If you say these are choices are done differently, fine, but then there would have to be a different decision theory to describe those choices.
Right. I mean, I guess I think, yeah, it's sort of a choice, but like there's going to be some idiosyncratic things. For instance, they're just going to ignore a lot of information that you give them, right?
Okay.
And so it's going to be hard to try to explain what it is to make such a choice well if it's written into the making of the choice that you're not willing to do trade-offs. What's the rational way to do it versus irrational when we're presupposing no trade-offs are allowed? I mean, I guess I just don't know what it would be to make a theory of that. And the thing I was offering was that in the case where you go the other way, where you're not deciding negatively, but you're deciding positively, that it's a lot like the case where I decide that I want to understand the equation. So people could decide that they want to come to see what it would be to love or laugh in the AI mode, right? How could our concepts of love and laughter be stretched such that we would still value this new kind? To my mind, that's the most promising avenue. And the idea, like, yeah, it'll be fine. It's just some other thing that's going to be a little bit different. That feels dismissive, and it feels like giving up on the value.
I wasn't trying to say it was just a little bit different.
Right, or it's just. But the point is that
I was trying to compare it to another large thing at stake. That was my argument, was to say this may be substantial, but this other thing you would have to give up is perhaps even bigger. So I'm comparing two big things. I'm not trying to dismiss something as little. I'm trying to say, but we're in a space of big things, and there are other, perhaps even bigger things at stake here. That the same sort of argument might be for citizen. I'm not going to say citizen participation doesn't matter either. I'm not going to trivialize that and say, who cares, and stop caring about that. I'm going to point to the larger consequences, in my view, of that. That is all the other things we're giving up as a result of that. And the same way in AI would be pointing to how much really we would be giving up if we went that direction.
Right. But like, if you think that my ability to value our our form of social organization is contingent on making room for citizen participation, such that I don't care that we have like more airports and trains, et cetera, if we don't, and more housing if we don't have citizen participation, because we'd have a bad society. So we have a bigger bad society.
Look, I mean, I might say like Europe doesn't have it, and they seem to have a fine society. So Europe is not known as an authoritarian society. It's pretty, widely celebrated.
You might make the argument that citizen participation isn't that valuable. That's the argument you're making now, right? Because you're saying, look, the Europeans do without it.
I might say it's valuable. It's just, you can't, doing without it doesn't mean it's not valuable. It's saying you can do without it does not mean to say it's trivial or small. It's saying that it's finite.
Right. But I guess I do think that people often have trouble like adopting a different value perspective from their own when a lot of stuff in their own mind is contingent on it. So that like suppose that somebody was like about to lose their only child, and you're like, look, there's people who don't have any children, and those people get along perfectly fine. It's fine. This is fine. It's bad. It's a little bit bad, but you'll have a happy life like those people without children. And suppose, in fact, it's not just that their child was about to die from a sickness, but you're about to murder their child. But you're like, but it's okay. It's for the greater good, and you're still going to be okay. You can imagine they would be very resistant to that. And they wouldn't be very persuaded by your argument that about the other people who don't have children.
So I guess a theme that's coming out of this conversation, which we can pursue in future podcasts if we want, is this idea that we tend to make big choices differently than small ones. We think about them somewhat different. And that might mean a different descriptive decision theory is appropriate in terms of how we go about it and what choices we tend to make. I'm still going to at least tentatively embrace the usual decision theory as a normative decision theory and say that people have trouble with big decisions. They're doing them badly. And these deviations are a signature of that, and that therefore things often go pretty wrong because people have trouble making big decisions. And I might point to some of these examples as evidence of that, saying, look how wrong big decisions can go. I guess I could give more examples, but that's part of what we're getting to in this discussion, is noticing that, say, regulating AI or regulating citizen participation or allowing it, is we're treating them differently, in some sense correlated with their just being big for us. They weigh a lot. They weigh heavy. And then, as you say, we often find it hard to imagine the world without them, without particular choices we've gotten used to. And that's part of our difficulty in making big decisions is if we're thinking of a big change from a status quo, we can see the status quo, we see how our world and our lives are tied up with it, and we might wonder if we can be motivated at all, even in a change to the status quo. We can't envision our motivations in that context, and we aren't so sure we would be motivated.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I think it's not right, and most people would think it's not right, that we would make these decisions better if we made them the way that we made the medium-sized decision. So imagine a parent who needs to decide whether or not to try and take out a loan for a life-saving medical procedure that probably won't work, but is like the last hope for their child. And but they have another child, right? And they really struggle to go through the reasoning of whether or not to pay for this medical procedure in the way that they would about whether or not they should buy a new vacuum cleaner. They're somehow not able to just be like, well, look, here's the cost of this, here's the cost of this, and like smoothly. I think most people wouldn't say, well, that person is defective, and they're making that decision in a defective way, because it'd be better if they thought about it just like the vacuum cleaner. I think it's a sign of something going right that they're unable to think about it like the vacuum cleaner. Namely, it's a sign that this, unlike a vacuum cleaner, this is something they actually really care about. So when people really care about something, the framework of standard decision theory doesn't work. And it's possible we shouldn't even think of these as decisions, I think. It's not that I think we're doing all of these things badly and we just take the framework and slap it on there and then just criticize this entire spate of activity. I don't think that makes sense, because the theory was supposed to, we can't have the theory dragging us around that way. It's supposed to go the other way. The theory is supposed to shed light on the thing that we're doing. And I think the fact that when we're making certain very charged and very fundamental decisions, that we systematically will exclude information, we will not make certain comparisons, we will not accept certain trade-offs, that's giving us information about what it takes for us to be motivated in life. And we shouldn't just ignore that information and say, yeah, what we're really supposed to do is just do it like the vacuum cleaner case. What we should say is, look, the fact that we're even motivated to buy a vacuum cleaner is coming from these other cases where we don't navigate those decisions that way.
We're nearly out of time, but I think it might be fun in a future episode to take some large decisions and walk through together how to think about them in a usual decision theory way and your alternative proposed way, and sort of try to walk through the details of some big decisions.
I'm just going to remind you that we did that once. We had an episode about you and I making certain important decisions, be about by getting divorced and you with your career change. And we noted that we did not make them in the traditional decision theory way, neither of us. And at the time, we didn't say that means we made them badly. We should have done it like the vacuum cleaner case.
Well, we didn't actually try to compare it to decision theory. We didn't do a detailed mapping of decision theory to those choices, but that might be a fine place to start with such an analysis.
Okay.
But I guess for today, that will have to be the minds almost met.
Okay.
All right. Bye.
Bye.